All right, so I'm gonna get us started. It's like 4 after, and there will be people filtering in, but I'm excited to get us started so that we have the full time. So my name is Rebecca Lemon, and I am the new director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities here at USC. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us today for a conversation about Brittany Friedman's new book, Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons, which just appeared with University of North Carolina Press in 2025. We do invite everyone who is able to please turn on their cameras if possible. That just makes it for a much nicer occasion so that we can see the faces of colleagues and friends who are here to support Brittany and her work. So joining us today, we have commentators Maris Curran, who is an independent filmmaker, and Robert Saleem Holbrook, who is with the Abolitionist Law Center. And the conversation will be moderated by our colleague here at USC, Hajar Yazdiha, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology. Today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Department of Sociology and the Charlotta Bass Journalism and Justice Lab. The program, for those of you who have not been to 11 Book Chat before, is quite simple. We start with a very short introduction to the book by Professor Friedman, and then she will be in conversation with Maris and Robert for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. At that time, we open the floor to questions from everyone, and Hajar will be kind of navigating through the timing here. You will be able to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand. Brittany, many congratulations on your wonderful book. Please tell us about it.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I am really appreciative for Levin organizing this event. I'm really grateful to see many faces I know and many faces I hope to get to know. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate our panelists today and our moderator. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And I know this is going to be a great conversation. Something I've been kind of reflecting on in anticipation for this event, but also because recently I've had the honor of having several conversations with people close to me that have read the book and new people that have read the book by just going to bookstores and then like meeting people that have like, oh, I read the book. So that has been really exciting. And something that has come up in those conversations is that many people see direct connections to our current political climate. And I see them too. And it's because we're currently in a world where chaos is routinely being overtly weaponized as a way to get people to shut down, to feel overwhelmed and like they can't function, and also to make people feel like they can't organize. And many people also report, even having difficulty getting out of bed because of the onslaught of violent updates that are in the news every day. And I would say that these updates, they're showing one human disaster after the other, which are caused by a commitment to greed and lies, and a commitment to control, which I talk about in my book. And I think on the upside, humanity is witnessing what the collapse of an empire looks like. And when any empire is on the cusp of falling, all of its darkness and evils are kicked up for everyone to see and to grapple with and figure out how we can move forward. And my book, Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons, traces how governments strategically use labels for these authoritarian ends. And I show how labeling people as dangerous enemies in order to seize and contain them is a strategy that is truly as old as human civilization, but its institutionalization within society through official means, through what I call extra legal means, and as a clandestine regime does have particular roots in European colonization and conquest, which I examined through the eyes of prisons and really bringing this notion of empire and prisons together. Because often, as scholars of the carceral state, we're not even really taught in like sociology of punishment anything about empire. And I find that so interesting because there's no way you can talk about that without talking about the carceral. And I think now more and more people are seeing how disappearances in prisons are the long-term strategies that have been used by our society to decimate the truth and decimate human lives in return for an illusion of progress and democracy. And so, thank you for being here and listening to my few words. And I can't wait to see how this conversation evolves.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I find your book to be so brilliant, so I'm super excited for our conversation today. I'm going to hand it off to Saleem for about 10 to 15 minutes of reflections and comments.
Thank you. Um, the first I want to say is, man, this book, there's so much to unpack in this book because you're dealing with everything from colonialism, apartheid, neoliberalism, and how, to an extent, it all plays out on the carceral level. And someone once said that prisons are like a microcosm of society, and I would definitely say that. I think, though, that the difference is that all of the larger either racial ills or social ills are magnified probably tenfold within that small microcosm. Everything down to just identity, masculinity, everything. Spending 27 years in prison, I could tell you that everything is hyper. Everything is intense. And so for me, reading this book really brought me back to um, a lot of how we were struggling, those of us who were politicized. And for me, I was fortunate that going into prison at the age of 16, going upstate at the age of 17, I was mentored by political prisoners in Pennsylvania. Um, because like George Jackson, who's someone that is very central to this book, I went into prison young and I was rebellious. And I tell people that I walked into that state prison 17 years old, 140 pounds, 5'7", but I acted as if I was 6'10", 280 pounds because I had to just project, and that just kept me going in and out of the hole. And in Pennsylvania, our holes were called special management units for those of us that really, really kept rebelling. In California, Brittany talks about the rise of the Adjustment Center, what was called the AC, and that was for rebellious prisoners, political prisoners. So I found myself in those type of units in the early and mid 90s. And I was really fortunate that political prisoners like Russell Maroon Schultz, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Fred Muhammad Burton, these were men that were part of the Black Panther Party, also part of the Black Liberation Army, mentored myself and many other young prisoners. But I think, though, reading this about how so much of our struggle was about creating liberated spaces in these factories of oppression, in these American apartheid, right? Because that's what apartheid is. And I think that we saw it play out in the prison environment. We're seeing it now play out live in front of us out here in society. I came up in a fierce anti-apartheid household during the 80s. And I grew up just understanding who Nelson Mandela was. When I went to prison, my mom sent me his autobiography. Um, and what we're seeing now, apartheid is really colonialism just played out on a domestic level. And I feel like that's what, not I feel like when we look at what's going on in the United States, if we look to apartheid that was started in South Africa, for people who have read the history of apartheid, that was a democratic process. Now, uh, the indigenous populations were kept out of it, But apartheid basically was a system that was created by white nationalists who were feuding with other settler colonialists, and they prevailed in the argument that we need to develop this system of separation, that we need to concentrate power in the hands of white minorities, and we need to just legislate it in. And when we look at what's happening now, I don't think it's unrealistic to say that we are witnessing in real time an American apartheid potentially developing, and we're certainly stepping into authoritarian trends in this country. And when you read George Jackson, when you read Professor Brittany's book, so much of the resistance in this book is to authoritarianism and racial violence, two things that we're seeing play out. So I would say that that microcosm that's prison was actually playing out what we're going through 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It's only developing out here right now. So it's really amazing for me now to just go back and reread George Jackson and reread some of these older tracks that I kind of got to dust off. Or, well, pre 2016, we had to, we thought that they were irrelevant. We were told that Obama's election was a post-racial society, but we see that that was actually the opposite. So, other areas that really resonated with me too was when I read about how you approach this project, Brittany, as a building a rebel archive. That was something too, again, that was profoundly powerful to me as someone who was on the inside. I just know how important it is to tell our own story, to tell our own narrative, to not have the state define us. George Jackson, so much of his resistance, his writings was him defining himself. His writings was him articulating the oppression, the injustice, and many of the people in this book who formed the Black guerrilla family in prison, that was what their struggle was too, about articulating the problems that they were facing, the solutions that they wanted to see, but also saying that prison is not that we're going to transcend prison. And that was our struggle too in Pennsylvania. We refused to allow prison to confine us. And when we talk about the punishment of whether it's revolutionary prisoners, politicized prisoners, I spent 10 years in solitary confinement. The longest I spent was 3 years consecutive. Most of my time in solitary confinement was not for the reckless, wild stuff that did when I was younger, because that was part of the script. It was like, okay, you guys are gonna assault each other. You guys are gonna kill each other. So you could just go do something and come right back out the hole. For me, the most repression I faced was actually when I started critiquing the system, when I started writing about it, when we started organizing against it, when we started learning the law to sue the prison system. Then I was like spending 2, 3 years in the hole, almost saying like, hey, I didn't assault nobody, and they're like, yeah, that's the problem, because we know how to deal with that. The prison system is built to deal with you guys killing each other, you guys even assaulting us. You guys now articulating an alternative to this, or actually daring to define yourselves, or to pursue your self-determination, or say that, like, I don't accept your unjust treatment. That to them is like intolerable. So we're seeing that though now, again, to what Brittany talked about earlier, the correlation. We're seeing a administration that is targeting dissent, right? And not just targeting it, but the same way the guards use white supremacists to attack prisoners, which it did not just play out in California, it played out in Pennsylvania, it played out all over the country. We see the administration using certain language to kind of target people through, whether it's through extrajudiciary means or even through some of the more deranged extremist element out there. So your book is really timely in the political environment. It's almost uh so forward thinking that you set out to write this years ago. But as I was reading it and rereading it the past week, it just really resonated with me. I'll be honest, at first I was reading it just as someone who was in the prison system, was so inspired by George Jackson, California prisons. I was kind of reading it like to get regrounded, rejuvenated, but reading it now, it was just so timely. Um, and then one thing I'll close with, I think, because I'm probably almost at time or at time, is that I really appreciated that part of the book where you talk about the boys comments about empire goal was to create basically slums of the world, right? That they could exploit. And I think that we have reached the end stage of that. I believe that we are now in an era where the world that capitalism, imperialism, and then its final stage, neoliberalism ravaged is now coming apart. And even domestically, it's coming apart. And there's two ways we could look at it. One way is it's frightening, which, I was at an event the other day and someone was asking me how did I uh, survive 27 years in prison, and she commented that she just wakes up every day crying because of the political environment. We can approach it like that, or we can approach it as this is an exciting moment in that we can dare to be impossible now. We can dare to create the world what we want. We could be unrestrained. The same way George Jackson, members of the Black Guerrilla family, and so many other prisoners that were subjected to um, targeted assassinations in a closed environment of prison dared to struggle in their environment, dared to live out their dreams, dared to create the world that they wanted to create. So that's how I choose to look at it, as the latter. I'm going to approach this moment as an exciting moment, acknowledge that it's frightening, but also create the world that I want to live in, and also be unrestrained in advocating for what I believe in. So those are just my reflections on this book, and I could talk about it all day, as y'all could see. So we just really appreciate so much to have this opportunity just to share my reflections on the book.
Thank you so much, Saleem. We really appreciate your reflections. There is so much there that's so powerful, and I hope we can come back to a couple of those points. Audience members, I hope you're thinking through your questions and jotting them down, because there's so much that's fruitful here for talking about just the current moment and then also connecting the past to the present, thinking about the future. I want to hand it over to Maris. We'd love your reflections as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here. And Saleem, I think that you talked a lot about many of the things that are resonant in the book. And I also really appreciate you sharing your own personal experience and underlining so much that Brittany wrote about. I'm a filmmaker, and part of the reason that I am here to talk about this beautiful book is also to talk about how it was made. So both the lens, the voice, and also the methodology, because it's Saleem mentioned that in making this, Brittany created a rebel archive, and she interviewed 41 people to create this book, and it had a very specific, very thoughtful methodology. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that from the very beginning of the book, and also ask Brittany a few questions as I reflect on that. So I really wanted to begin at the beginning of the book, begin in the prologue, because there's a very specific lens that is personal, that Brittany begins in the very beginning of the prologue. She says, "My family comes from all throughout the Deep South, but I grew up in Missouri. Born in 1914, early Ida Marie Coffey Wilderness Avery, my maternal grandmother, was once a sharecropper and a young mother evicted from her home. My mother's family found a photograph of Grandma holding my aunt, surrounded by their belongings on the highway in southeast Missouri. It's held by the Library of Congress. The archive labeled the photograph "Evicted Sharecropper." But when I see the image, I see my family, our hopes and dreams, and a world that has forced us to be resilient. I'm going to skip a moment, a little ahead, where Brittany also reflects that strong and unstoppable, Grandma taught me that in this family, we speak the truth. This book is grounded in a Black feminist lineage that is about uncovering and deeply truth-telling. And she breaks that methodology down in the appendix. She says, truth-telling as a method is a practice of discovery, of rebuilding that which has been attacked, and of digging in the dark corners of our society to reveal the hidden. Black feminists have been doing this work for centuries, weaving together histories and creating methods for revolution. Truth-telling as method has taught me that without access to key records and oral histories, the state can prevent us from fully theorizing the reality of racist intention that is rooted in the operation and structure of entire systems and institutions, rather than solely the individual racism of a few bad actors. As scholars, truth-telling as method is a process of catharsis, of raising lies up from the dead and of dreaming a new reality in their wake. To me, this kind of begins to really set the lens of the entire book, right? It's one that is personal, it's one that's embodied, and it's one that is, I think that it's a very specific choice to have such a personal and embodied lens when you're talking about a population that is incarcerated. And so, Brittany, I wanted to ask you from Go what it was, why for you was it so important to ground this book in such a personal lens and in such an embodied language, which I think really, for me as a reader, shows that you're taking yourself as an author kind of in a very whole person kind of point of view, but also all of your protagonists, all of these men who are incarcerated and are facing torture, that you're really looking at them in a kind of whole body, whole human point of view. So I was curious, when setting out to write this book, why was it so important that the lens was so personal?
Thank you so much, Maris, for this question. You know, I got a little emotional when you were reading the part about my grandma. I always get emotional on that part, even though I wrote it. You know, it's first I inserted myself in places in the book because I never wanted someone to read it and feel like I was disembodied, like I wasn't actively engaging in, you know, really excavating, but also holding space for people to share and to reflect and also even teach. You know, many people that I spent a lot of time with, had several conversations with in person, on the phone, with their families, right? You know, they were also teaching their descendants about their life story. And so it was very common, right? I would have dinner with people and their loved ones would be around. And I wanted the reader to understand that approach and that experience as a writer, as a sociologist, but as a human being, right? As a human being that is there, is I was doing my best to be very transparent because I never want to cause harm. I know we're going to get to certain points where harm is going to come up. And so it's my job to be a safe person. And you can't be a safe person if you're a dishonest person. And so I believe that one of the main things you can do to be safe is to be honest and transparent, to be clear, if you will, to provide clarity, to provide space for clarity to emerge without judgment. Um, and I also felt that as a writer in this process, I needed to bring the reader in so that you could see the full human experience of the people that I spent time with. Because, you know, for example, the person that I gave the pseudonym Anthony, you know, I spent argued the most time with him and with his family out of everyone. And I really felt like I had to bring you into that space of meeting his family, spending that time, because there's so much emotion involved in this process of excavation and of honesty on both sides that I also that was a part of my work process. I paid attention to emotion versus just ignoring it, knowing, like, you know, as a researcher, you're like, would I include that in my write-up, if you will? But for me, it was more like, if I'm sharing the full experience of the story, right? It's the story of of what I'm sharing from the community, but it's also a story of me getting to that place where I would even have the honor to hear someone's life story, because no one has to tell you anything, right? Like no one is obligated to share with you anything about themselves, or even the full extent of their experience. And so I wanted all of that transparency and grace, and trust, and all of the emotions in between that come from building relationships with people that are real to shine through, so that in this book where there's many horrors, there's humanity is never lost, because that is what the system is trying to do that I'm describing and showing you. And I wanted to just center humanity throughout the book, because that was one of the most beautiful lessons I learned from everyone that I spent time with and that I still keep in touch with. Some people I still keep in touch with that are in my book to this day. And, is the fact that I learned so much about humanity and about the power of coming together, as Saleem was saying, right? Like he's leaning into the latter. I learned so much about that creative spirit in the face of odds that we couldn't even imagine unless you experienced it, right? From that process. And I was learning throughout the whole time I even embarked on this project. And I wanted to make that clear for anyone who reads it.
Thank you. I wanted to ask another question. So I know that you, for this book, did 41 life interviews, right? So you sat down with people on kind of every side of this experience, mostly with revolutionaries who were previously incarcerated. And I'm curious about that number, 41, right? That I think you could have written an excellent book with 10 interviews, right? You could have written an excellent book with 15 interviews. You could have only interviewed inmates, but you chose to to interview people from multiple aspects of this. And then I also wanted to ask one more kind of question about your methodology, because you talk about this idea of intuitive social science, right? And I think that that's a really interesting concept. It's the concept that is about engaging all of the senses as you are writing, both in terms of the way that you're writing and also the way that you're interviewing and engaging people. So I was wondering if you would mind answering those together.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I so in terms of the number of interviews, I would say because of the type of method I was using, it's like I set out to do, like, in my proposal, I'm like, I'm gonna do 50 interviews and I have to get to 50 because my advisor said I gotta get to 50. And it was just but I didn't really resonate with the fact that I had to get to that number. For me, I more so resonate with notions of what is the point in the research, especially with hidden populations, right? Populations that intentionally conceal themselves even outside of prison for fear of repression. Like when you're working with hidden populations, people that have experienced extreme repression and currently do still or could if their identities were revealed, that number it's not the same, right? When you get to the point where you have reached a consensus. And I reached that consensus much earlier, actually, even like to your point, like I reached it much earlier, but I decided, I also didn't want to turn away anyone. So as I'm going through the process, like if someone's like reaches out, because I shared my number widely, like I created a Google number and then I had my cell phone and it was just like circulating. So people would call me and say, I spoke to so and so. I heard you're doing this. And I wouldn't confirm who I spoke to, but I'd say, I'd love to keep talking and set up a conversation in person. And so that kind of emerged organically. But through the process, I really learned, there's so much work on hidden populations, but I learned it for myself in the field that it really is true. Like you don't, I think approaching with a number is the wrong way to go when you're setting out. Um, and in term and I also too, like, the archival collections that I engaged with, many of the collections that were private came through interviews. So I would say, one of my favorite collections, and I will say I became inspired to build a Rebel archive when I first read the work of Kelly Lytle Hernandez, and I didn't know that's what I was doing because again I wasn't assigned her book. Like, I wasn't assigned her book. I found her book on my own, and then I read her book, and I was like, that's what I'm doing. I'm having to like actually investigate for information in a way that, like, I wasn't trained to do. I was not trained to do this in like my methods class. If anything, I would say the closest I came to was I was a history undergrad major. And so I did learn in my undergraduate history major, like, we did learn how to investigate for archives and like find lost sources, those sorts of things. So that I had to bring all of that back. And, I think one of the most beautiful private archives I came across was because of an interview with someone who was a member of the original Black Panther Party. And after our interview, he's like, let me just show you everything I have. And I was like, okay. I didn't know that everything he had was like an entire house, his entire attic, the basement, filled with all of these documents that he kept and people would send to him. And I was like, what? Like, I had no, I felt like I had stumbled into a room like you see, even in like a movie where like the doors open, and I was looking around like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. But then again, I think without taking the time to build that trust, I don't think that would have happened. I think we would have had our interview and he would have just said, okay, thank you, and just like led me out. And he even said that. He's like, I don't let everyone in here because I don't want this information to get into the wrong hands, if you will, or to have someone come and try to take it. Um, and I'll just say a little bit about, I appreciate you bringing in that book chapter on intuitive social science that I wrote with Michael Walker a couple years ago. I mean, the way that I came to that was when I finished writing a first draft of the book, and I knew Michael's work because um he, before he even published his book, like, he had shared with me some of the chapters, and I knew what he was doing and his method and his approach to, being his full self in the field, going back to that notion of transparency, but also very consciously taking note of your own emotions and feelings in the field and taking note of others and not skipping over emotion, feelings, like the environment as though it's like a backdrop, but actually really including it in your field notes as a part of the whole process. And so we bonded over that. And I said to him, I was like, I have this opportunity to write a piece for this new volume coming out at NYU Press. And it's gonna, like, they want me to write something about methods. And I feel like I want to write this piece, but I don't want to write it without you because I know that you do this too. And we have this in common. And like, I think it's intuitive social science. And he was like, yeah, that's what it is. So we set out to write that chapter, and I really love that chapter. I come back to it often. Um, and I appreciate you mentioning it because I do talk about it in the methods, and it really grounded me and also helped me not feel alone, because there's been times where I've had people say, like, why would you include that? Like, even in the draft that includes like Hugo's emotions, like, why would you include that? And I'm like, well, because I spent time with his family, and his family was telling me how he felt, and I make note of it in the footnote. I say where I get the information from, and then I include the information because his family thinks that that's important, and I think it's important too. And I hope that more and more, we include that in our writing and in the full scope of our ethnographic and archival and interviewing work, and not, edit ourselves and edit it out in the final version.
I would just add one final thing, which I think that building on everything that you've talked about right now, Brittany, that I think that also you approach this book with a real poetics of language, and you write it from in very narratively. And I think that it's a really strong choice that also makes the book, one could think about, well, using poetic language when talking about something this violent could soften it, right? And I think it's actually the opposite. I think that it strengthens the book and it makes it even more accessible, and makes it accessible to even wider audiences, which then expands its reach and hopefully its impact. So I want to congratulate you on the book, and I think that it's very strong, and I agree that it's necessary reading, particularly in the time that we're in right now. And I hope that folks pick up the book if they haven't read it yet.
Thank you so much, Maris. And truly, thank you for the deep dive into the methods. I think that's really helpful also for the graduate students that are attending here today. But also, there is something really beautiful about the approach in that it does humanize both the scholar, I think, and the quote unquote subject. Um, I want to open it up to questions. Feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you. And as we wait for questions to come in, I would love to take the first one. I have so many questions. Just reflecting on Saleem and Maris's comments and Brittany, your reflections as well. I think truth telling is, for me, one of the most powerful takeaways of the book, both as sort of the method, but then also as a set of findings. And I would love to hear all three of you actually reflect on kind of the role of truth telling in what you do, whether it's in art and film, it's in scholarship, it's in the actual, activist work on the ground as a nonprofit, as, somebody working with imprisoned individuals. It seems to me that in this moment, truth is under attack in every direction. And a lot of us are kind of wondering about in a time when there are real dangers to speaking the truth, to speaking it in particular places, to making particular claims. How do we strategize around the truth? So, Brittany, maybe we could start with you.
Yes, thank you, Haj. This is an excellent question, and I'm excited to see what Maris and Saleem have to say also. I mean, I can just say that it wasn't easy writing that section, and it was, and I mean, it may not seem like it, but it really did take me a lot of reflecting on, I'm going to say what I want to say, like regardless of like whatever happens, whatever consequences. And that's because throughout the process of crafting this book, it was a very small group of people who were really supporting like what I was doing, and a much bigger group of people that were like, what is truth, like in a philosophical way, like what is truth? And I'm like, well, I spent years triangulating between various sources, like explaining it in that way, just so that I could stand, like, if you will, on business. Like I could stand on what I said. So I think that, that is something that is extremely important in this day and age is, that's why I wanted to interview people from a variety of experience. That's why I also interviewed people who actually participated in white supremacist violence. It's why I took the time to go through um, many different types of archives that originated in so many different ways, because I wanted to see where do we have a convergence where the same thing is coming up across everyone, and even in the past people that are not even alive anymore are saying the same thing. And I think we can do that as scholars. I don't think we have to shy away from speaking on the truth and just in having our receipts, if you will, to back it up and say, this is how I got here. So someone else can even go back and check and see how you got there, and not obscuring how you got there, I think is incredibly important. And that's one of the first ways you can actually tell a lie, is because there's a lot of obscurity as how to how someone even got to their opinion or their point. It's like very foggy. But thank you.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. Saleem or Maris, either of you, do you want to jump in?
Sure,
Um,
could you, Maris, you want to go first?
Oh, I think quickly, I think building off of that, that in my work, especially in documentary, it's about truth telling is about embracing complexity, right? It's about making space for people's whole selves and making space for truths that are not often simple truths. And I think that in the moment that we are existing in right now, there is not a lot of room made for complexity and made for identities that have a lot of hyphens and for kind of messy truths that reflect our lives. And I think it's really important that we make space for that.
Definitely, and I think I kind of touched on it a little earlier too when I was just talking about being able to define yourself. To me, that's part of the truth-telling process. Um, I will say that like it is definitely a challenge because in order to be a part of the truth-telling process, you have to a lot of vulnerabilities come with the complexities. So that is for me, I always find really hard to navigate. Prison is not a vulnerable environment. It is not a transparent environment. So that is some things that I've been trying to grapple with. And also, in prison, there's consequences for truth telling. Actually, there's consequences of truth telling, period. But in prison, again, it's really magnified. And I know, um, Brittany, that you had challenges, and I did kind of have want to ask you a question too about some of the challenges of like the repercussions from some of this. Like this is like really deep historical truths that the people that you interviewed are talking about. So for me, um, just reading this, it took a lot for them. You mentioned it, their vulnerabilities, like, and also there were some really deep vulnerabilities that were exposed in this. So I completely embrace it. I think that it's really part of the politicalization process, and it's also part of just the process of putting together a good archive.
Thank you so much. Kelly, you have a question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly. I'm a first year sociology PhD student at USC. Number one, Brittany, I really want to thank you for your vulnerability and your aspect on humanity in your research, because one thing I've learned is research is me search. And I feel like when it comes to research, like I feel like the way it's talked about is really seems like we're just doing a study, but I really appreciate you like giving it your all and like really truly like giving like a part of yourself and really trying to like, get to know the people that you're with. My question for you is, what we're seeing in the media today is a lot of like either lack of empathy for people or like selective empathy, right? Um, and as someone who like studies how schools are like microcosms of prisons, like I study like the school to prison pipeline, like that's what I noticed in my undergrad study, and that's what I want to continue studying. My question for you is like, how do we go about like trying to like really recruit people for the movement or like just trying for people to see different perspectives because I fear like it's just hard because like we are seeing the end of an empire like with everything that's going on like we are seeing the end of the US state as we know it. It's like how do we keep that like how do we build that community like how do we like sustain it but also like how do we like recruit people because we're seeing a lot of like lack of empathy or selective empathy for like seeing what happened with Charlie Kirk, and but then when a black man is lynched on a college campus the next day, it's radioactive silence, or like the same type of like noise that they have for Charlie Kirk, but kid like there was a school shooting that same exact day, and nobody really talked about it. So I know that's kind of a rant, but it's like how do we keep that empathy, or like how do we like recruit others to really see the the lack of humanity that our system has when it's like I don't know, like I'm just kind of like trying to like how do we go about it as well? Like do you have any like thoughts or tips on how to like really for us to keep that humanity like and like how do we spread it to others? Like how do we like recruit people to see it?
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate your thoughts and your reflection and your question. I think that it's so important. I think the best way that I can answer it is is something that I do tend to get asked a lot is like, how could you sit in a room with someone that you know committed violence against your own racial group? And not just once, but for years and consecutively as a part of their identity, like their organizational identification. And what they're talking about is, you know, in the book, especially I think the interview with the person that I give the pseudonym Andrew, um, and how like you know his hands are covered in swastikas still, that he's been out, he's served a little over 40 years in prison in his life, and you know and ended up in Pelican Bay. And for me, the way that he and I connected, right? It was real. We had a real, and what I would say, it was with everyone that I spoke to, I tried to build a heart connection. And what I mean by that is that I'm being my full transparent self and I give them space to do the same without inserting myself across their boundary, no matter who I'm talking to. And creating that space with him, I think I noticed over the days that we spent together, because our interview was over days and we were just sitting on a porch, was that the intensity in his shoulders and like the clenching in his hands over time just relaxed, because he realized that I wasn't there to be like, and you did this and you did this and that and you're horrible and you're this and that. Instead, I showed up as myself. I said, you know, this is what my goals are here. I would like to understand how did you get to certain points in your life? I would, and in your own words, how do you see it? And something super interesting to me is that allowing him the space to do that one on one, he said many of the same things in terms of how he got there that people who were on completely other sides in terms of organizational ties saying very similar things, right? And I don't think that I would have been able to get there if I didn't show up with an honesty that I really did want to try to understand. I wanted to understand. And I think that often, right, exist in these we exist in spaces where even if we're ideologically aligned, we still talk past each other. Like even in spaces where I feel like all of us have the same opinion, we're just going and no one's listening. And I think that you know, I don't think that fully answers your question and it doesn't give us solutions. I guess I'm just speaking from my experience, is that that was how I was able to do it and how I was able to sit through certain things that like on a personal level like might have really upset me, right? If I'm sitting there listening to him speaking. But I also wanted to, the book wouldn't be honest if everybody wasn't honest in terms of to the best of their ability. And that's how I think we should approach things. And that's why for me this book taught me, I feel like I do feel like I could talk to anybody after the years in the field doing this. I feel like I could talk to anyone irregardless of their viewpoint, even if I don't agree and even if I have all of my different thoughts about it. And I don't want to go on and rant because we're getting close to time. I would love to hear what Saleem and Maris think about this question too, because I think that's just my own personal philosophy, even outside of research. Like as a person, I believe in freedom and I believe in boundaries and I believe in approaching things with a level of integrity and authenticity. And if I don't um, if I don't vibe or I don't gel with whatever's going on, I just remove myself versus trying to overtly um, assert myself unless like I need to defend myself. Um, so I think that's just a way of being.
Maris and Saleem, I wonder if you have any thoughts too on Kelly's question, sort of just, generally this question of how you bring people into the fold, especially when maybe they're approaching the truth from a different perspective or positionality. And, to Brittany's point, when folks are just talking past each other, do you have sort of strategies for doing that, whether it's in organizational work or in art and film?
And can I just I'm sorry, Maris. I'm really sorry. I just wanted to add one thing about Andrew's interview because I just so that it's not unclear, is that by the end of that interview, I just want to clarify that he did say to me that, this whole system is rigged and they just wanted us fighting each other and they wanted us to kill Black people because it made it easier to control. And that's what I mean explicitly when I say that people are, by the end, he was saying the same thing. Like he saw the system by the end, but we wouldn't have got there, I think, if I approached him in a different way.
I mean, I think that Kelly brought up this idea of selective empathy, right? That was kind of one of the main groundings of what I heard in your question. And earlier, Saleem, you were talking about vulnerability, right? And how, the ways that we can kind of really meet each other and understand each other and across divides is through vulnerability. And so I think that as a filmmaker, one of the ways that you can kind of create empathy is through first being vulnerable as a maker, being vulnerable when you are having, as Brittany said, these kind of heart conversations, right? That it starts with the person who's kind of creating the work and fostering the conversations, but that it really is about making sure that there's exposure, right? That we're creating stories like this story that this book that Brittany wrote, and saying like, you might not understand this history and you might not understand and have empathy for folks that we meet, like Andrew, for example, right? And that it was important for you to include his story so that there is an understanding of a really rich, complicated, very, very complicated story.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I'm just I think you have to tell stories, as much as I kind of push back to sharing my story, because for me, if I do share it, I'm not trying to like look for pity or sympathy. So it comes back to that ownership, right? It comes back to agency. But I do think that we have stories are ways of reaching people, as well as even Andrew recognizing at the end that all that killing, all that fighting, everything that he did really was just to preserve a system that didn't even care about him. That's the one thing, it didn't care about them. They were expendable too. They just did the dirty work. And look, he spent 40 something years in prison. So they didn't give him no early release or anything like that. And that is fascism. That's authoritarianism. That's apartheid. That's what we even see that with some of these people who are so gung ho on defending this regime here. It doesn't care about them. I do have one question though. I kind of want to take advantage of having the mic to ask a question of Brittany, and this is just related to the archives. For me, in the law work that we do, I always get a glimpse of the enemy when we can file depositions and right to know requests and have access to their uh, documents, their internal documents, their emails. I would just like to know, for you, having access to some of the deepest archives of the state, how did it feel for you to be reading like the mind of the enemy, the bureaucracy of the enemy? It's, and what's even crazier, that these mundane memos that you were reading, that very boring, very bureaucratic jargon, actually they'll set the stage for all this violence that you write about and that emerged.
I love this question, Salim, because and I know that we have that shared method in our work, right? Of using investigative methods. And in particular for this book, I often was saying like, oh my God, when I was like I constantly would just like in my head or sometimes out loud would be like, oh, I think it was even audible like the times when I like in the archive and I would be going through and I'm just like, what? Like I was very much just like in shock sometimes of what I had. Like I was like I couldn't believe that I had it almost like the smoking gun, right? Like you I couldn't believe I had it. I was like, what? And I think that was my reaction often, but then once I got past the shock of what I was holding on to, then I was like, well, like I have a duty to to make this known. I can't now that I have seen it, I can't unsee it and others need to see it too. And that's my thought even in my research lab as well. When we are doing FOIA for like pay to stay lawsuits, we recently for the state of Michigan, they accidentally included a bunch of emails. Like, and the emails are bad. Like the emails are bad. They're going back and forth talking about like the lawsuits and how they're plotting. And I know they didn't mean to do it in the FOIA, but because they gave it to us, they can't take it back. And now we have it. And now I'm like, well, they're like, well, should we use the emails in our analysis? Yes, we should, because in the analysis, we can actually even further like strengthen what we are saying, whether it's, you know, academically or whether we're saying it in a public forum about the coordination, like the coordination of actual evil, like plotting to take down whole populations for your own greed. And I think in this case, like, you know, one thing that I will just end on, because I know we're at time to say is like in the state archive when I was going through the director's investigation files, and it was their COINTELPRO, like the California Department of Corrections, their version of COINTELPRO, and going through his personal investigation files. And there was a whole section there on Black Muslims because the Nation of Islam, as I write in the book, was the first organized group that was targeted by this system. And, you know, someone had written in very faint, like it was like fading, a racial slur, like on the side in the margins. And I think that's another, I think it's Sadia Hartman who talks about in the margins, but like in your archival work, you will see things like that. Like somebody was writing like little notes, and there was often, I didn't talk about it in the book, but sometimes I wish I did. Like when I'm holding their own records, I could see all the notes, the directors putting notes and things, and it's like, wow, these are originals. Like these are original sources, and I can see their thought process when they're annotating this system. So that was really powerful for me, and it's why I love archival work and why I love investigative work as a method of research and truth telling.
That was the perfect note to end on, Brittany. I think, you know, in your own words, we have a duty to tell the truth. And I so appreciate that. I want to thank our amazing panelists, Maris Curran and Saleem Holbrook, and then congratulate our brilliant author, Brittany Friedman. Thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you for the great discussion.